Joining me now is Mervin Jebaraj, economist with the University of Arkansas Walton College of Business. Mervin, good to be with you. Thank you for being here. Let's begin with jobs data. The last time you and I were together, and we talked about how the unemployment rate was kind of this questionably low 4.2%. It seems there's been a revision to that number at the state level.
Yeah, I think we were fully expecting a revision to happen. Before we entered this pandemic at the beginning of last year, the unemployment rate was around 3.5%. It had been around 3.5% for a long time in our state, which was a record low unemployment rate. So to see at the end of the year, given everything that was still happening in the economy related to the pandemic, the high level of cases, businesses still closing, and so on and so forth, we were surprised to see that the unemployment rate was only about 0.7% higher than it was before the pandemic, when we thought we had a record low unemployment rate. So they have revised that unemployment rate in line, more in line with what our expectations would have been. So the unemployment rate in the state is actually closer to 5%. It's about 1.5% higher than where we were before we entered the pandemic. There's still some labor force issues that we need to sort out. And, in addition to all of that, we need to understand that there are large sectors of our economy that have come back closer to normal. There are some sectors of our economy that are growing compared to last year. But there are, the remaining jobs that are left are heavily concentrated that haven't come back, are heavily concentrated in leisure and hospitality and manufacturing and education and health services. So you're looking at something like 14,000 jobs and 12,000 jobs and 10,000 jobs respectively in those sectors statewide that are still out. And a lot of those jobs, are actually in the big metro areas in central Arkansas and in northwest Arkansas. So there's still some heavy job losses in some sectors that we need a lot more work to get back to normal, while the rest of the economy and the rest of the industrial sectors seem to be on a more even footing at this point.
Congress has been in action over the last 2 weeks or so. A big stimulus COVID relief bill at $1.9 trillion has passed and signed into law by the President Joe Biden. There were a few modifications to it. Tell me, what do you think are going to be three major things that you think this bill will have an impact on, good or bad?
Yeah, so I think, there are the immediate stimulative effects of this bill, and then, as we can talk about this later, is that there are some longer term impacts from this bill as well. But the immediate COVID-related stimulus obviously comes from the headline that everybody has been talking about, and a lot more ink has been spilt about, so we will talk about it here as well, is that people are going to get another $1,400 check per person. The design of that check has changed compared to, say, the CARES Act that was passed at the end of March last year. So on the one hand, $1,400 is higher than $1,200 that went out in March, not by a lot. But you have to remember that $600 also went out at the end of December and maybe early January for households. So put those two things together, that's $2,000 going to households. The design of that has changed in the sense that now it pays out to every dividend an equal amount. So the old CARES Act, was $1,200 for the adults, $500 per dependent. In this particular iteration, it's just going to be $1,400 for adults and dependents. So if you're a family of four, between the $600 that you got in December and the $1,400 that should be hitting people's accounts sometime this month, later this month, that's $2,000 per person. So if you're a family of four, two adults and two children, you're looking at $8,000 hitting your bank account in that time period. $5,600 from this bill, and $600 each from the previous bill that passed in December. So that's a big chunk of the bill, obviously, and that's the one that's gotten a lot of the headlines. The one, the aspects that I guess I am more interested in talking about, I guess, would be the unemployment benefits were supposed to expire. The ones that passed at the end of December were supposed to expire at the end of this week. So those have been extended all the way through to September. So that's good news. That provides a $300 weekly boost to state level unemployment benefits, which, as we discussed several times, only cover about 45% or so of a person's wages. So this gets you a lot closer to being whole while you remain unemployed. And as we discussed, the unemployment is concentrated in leisure and hospitality and manufacturing and education and health services. So to see this $300 boost exist all the way through to September gives a lot more economic security to those families that have been unemployed for a very long period of time. And in particular, those sectors are unlikely to recover very fast. And obviously, the vaccination schedule has improved. The number of vaccines available has improved, even though the vaccination rates haven't gone up as much as we would like in this state. So that economic boost for the unemployed folks in that particular sector is going to be very important. The one piece that we hadn't we had been talking a lot about, especially when we talked about bars and restaurants losing a lot of revenue last year, and they did receive help in the form of PPP loans in March, and then that was extended again in December. But the way the PPP loans were designed was at the end of something like 60% had to be used for payroll, only 40% could be used for other expenses like mortgage and rent and utilities and those types of fixed costs that restaurants had. And we discussed that when we looked at sales tax figures for the state last year, we saw that bars revenue was down about 50% during the pandemic. Restaurants, full service restaurants, were down about 11% during the pandemic. Fast service restaurants were down about 5% during the pandemic. So some fairly significant losses across the board. Obviously, far worse for the bars than the full service restaurants, than the limited service restaurants. So I think the important piece here that's different from the PPP loans is that there has been another $29 billion nearly added to this stimulus bill to provide direct grants to businesses that are restaurants and bars to make up for their revenue shortfall between 2019 and 2020. So each restaurant and bar qualifies for up to $5 million. Which obviously is a fairly large amount, so a lot of smaller restaurants and bars would be making a smaller amount than that, and they can claim the difference between their loss from 2019 to 2020 in terms of revenue up to $5 million. So more than the PPP loans, I think this grant, because it's not something that you need to pay back or anything, will go a much longer way towards making sure that restaurants and bars that had suffered a lot last year and are still suffering have a much better chance of making it past this pandemic and remaining open, and then all those jobs, and obviously all of us like to be at those restaurants and bars, are going to see them more likely to see them in operation with this grant. So I think people have been arguing for this grant for a very long period of time, and so it's finally there, and it looks like it should solve a lot of not every problem. Some restaurants and bars have already closed, and this is not going to help them. But the ones that are teetering along, ones that might close soon, the ones that might continue to struggle later this year and then close, this should help them, make up for their revenue loss in 2020. So that's a big deal. There's about a smaller amount than that for music venues, which again have been shuttered this entire time. And people are not interested in going in indoor music venues either. So there's a couple of $1 billion or so just for music venues, the same type of grant program that matches their revenue loss. So those are, I think, to me, far more interesting in terms of the stimulative aspect. They actually provide direct COVID relief to them. The unemployment benefits are one of them, but all the headlines are going to be on those $1,400 checks.
Let's talk too about the longer term aspects of this bill with respect to the child tax credit. That seems to have some tax implications that could go on well after COVID-19 to me.
Yeah, so this is a huge change, the child tax credit change that is happening now. To be fair, it's only a temporary 1-year time period. Obviously, Congress is very intent on making that a permanent tax credit. So the current tax credit pays about $2,000 per child. But it's not fully refundable. So there are a lot of families that miss out on that child tax credit. So for one, the tax credit is it's increased. It's going to be $3,000 if your child is over the age of 6 and under the age of 18. And it's going to be $3,600 per child if the child is under the age of 6. So that's one change. It's either $1,000 or $1,600 more depending on how old your child is. But it's also going to be fully refundable, unlike the previous tax credit. So the way to think about this is not so much a tax credit as more like a guaranteed income per child that will go towards child raising expenses. And it's temporary for 1 year, but I think there are plans. For example, Senator Mitt Romney proposed a plan to make this permanent and run this through the Social Security Administration and provide monthly checks to families. So it would be about $300, whatever it is, per month going to families to help per child. That's not the current design, obviously, but the way they have designed this temporary bill is that half of that tax credit, $3,600 or $3,000, depending on how old your child is going to come upfront to you from a check from the IRS. So they're going to send half of that now and then half when you file your taxes next year. So it'll be better and a better guaranteed income for families to help with child raising expenses when we change the design in the next go around and make it just a monthly check that comes from the Social Security Administration, for example. So that's, again, a significant chunk of money coming in. Nationally, that amount of money, the change in the child tax credit, the move from $2,000 to $3,000 to make it fully refundable, is expected to cut child poverty in half this year. So that's very significant. In Arkansas, that means 48,000 children are going to move above the poverty line as a result of this change in the child tax credit. And close to 660,000 children in Arkansas, which is about 94% of all the children in Arkansas, will benefit in some fashion from the fact that the child tax credit is now $3,600 or $3,000, and that it's fully refundable. So there's a lot of impacts to Arkansas families from this particular change in the tax credit. And just to make sure that childless adults are not left out of this as well, is that they have also modified the earned income tax credit for childless working adults. And that is now moved from $530 to $1,500. So there's a significant chunk, about 180,000 Arkansans will benefit, that are childless and working, will also benefit from the earned income tax credit improvement. So if we're doing all this math here, if you're a family, 2 adults and 2 children, let's just say above the age of 6, between the $600 checks, the $1,400 checks from this stimulus, and the $3,000 checks per child, by the end of next year, around tax season, the government would have sent you about $14,000 to your family, which is a sizable chunk of money.